And I will start us off. So, hey everyone, I'm Sam Alkin, and welcome to our food safety office hours for March. Now, I'm a microbiologist, and I could sit for hours reminiscing about salmonella and listeria, but that might be too toxic for some people today. And toxicity is a good reminder about the importance of chemical food safety. And so today, we've got a special guest. We have Paul South, who is the director of the Division of Plant Products and Beverages at FDA's Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition in the Office of Food Safety. He's responsible for developing policy, regulations, regulatory guidance, and compliance strategies on issues related to the safety of plant products and beverages, including chemical contaminations in foods. He's currently the chair of the FDA's PFAS working group. He received his PhD in food science from Cornell University, so I got to give a big shout out to Big Red. And he's going to be bringing us up to speed on the latest draft guidance on action levels for lead in baby food and food for young children, and how that all fits into FDA's Closer to Zero initiative. Afterwards, we're going to have a great panel, including Jennifer Troughton, Deputy Commissioner from New York State Department of Ag and Markets. We're going to have Dr. Maria Ishida, who's the Director of the Food Laboratory for New York State Department of Ag and Markets. We've got Dr. Betsy Bin joining us, the Director of the Produce Safety Alliance. Dr. Olga Padilla-Zakor, Professor of Food Science and Director of the Food Venture Center here at Cornell. We'll also have Dr. Randy Warabo popping in, hopefully, one of my neighbors and Professor of Food Science. And then we also have Dr. Aliosa Trimchik, who is an Extension Associate in our Dairy Extension Program. And so with that, I'll be handing it over to Paul to kind of bring us up to speed on this Closer to Zero initiative and chemical food safety in foods.
Thanks so much, Sam. Good afternoon. Again, my name is Paul South. I'm a division director in the Office of Food Safety at FDA's Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. This is FDA's Center for Food, and we're located actually in College Park, Maryland, very close to DC. But first, I'd like to thank the organizers today for inviting me to speak at the Food Industry Virtual Office Hours, sponsored by Cornell's Institute for Food Safety. This wasn't available back when I was going to Cornell, so I think it's a great thing to do with our new virtual capabilities. Again, I did go to Cornell, graduated in I don't even want to say, but 1989. So I was around when there was Dr. Norman Potter was here, the food science book author, and Dr. Hotchkiss, as well as all the other professors. So I did graduate undergrad, and Dennis Miller was here as well. Did some work in the food industry. I went to Ecuador for a year with a colleague who had graduated with me and worked in the food industry in Ecuador. Then came back, worked in the food industry in Buffalo, joined some Cornell colleagues there as well at Rich Products. Sean Omani was there, and actually Ann Schneider, Larry Bogdan. There was just a number of different Cornell folks there. But then came back and did my master's and PhD with Dr. Dennis Miller at Cornell. And I just want to, again, thank Cornell for the education and training I did at Cornell in the food science department. So I am now and have been at Cornell, or rather Cornell FDA since 2000, and I've been working in the Office of Food Safety. Our division specifically works on chemical contaminants in food, so I do work on toxic elements like what we're talking about today, but also other chemical contaminants, pesticides as well, radionuclides, and then PFAS is or per polyfluoroalkyl substance is another chemical that's I guess we could call it emerging. But today I'll be talking a little about our recent released draft guidance for industry on action levels for lead in food intended for babies and young children. This guidance document was issued back in January, and it informs industry on action levels for lead in food intended for babies and young children. FDA doesn't have a lot of action levels, so it is quite unique that we are working on a lot of different action levels for foods at this time. But this is is part of our Closer to Zero plan. The proposed action levels would result in significant reductions in dietary exposure to lead, but also ensuring availability of nutritious food. This draft guidance, including the proposed action levels, as I mentioned, are part of the FDA's Closer to Zero plan, which sets forth FDA's science-based approach to continually reducing exposure to lead, but also arsenic, cadmium, and mercury to the lowest possible levels in foods intended for babies and young children. So next slide, please. So FDA considers the proposed action levels described in this guidance to be achievable by industry when certain control measures are taken to minimize the presence of lead. The purpose of this presentation is to provide these proposed action levels. Again, I note these are proposed, not final, so they can change based on comments received and other work we're currently doing at FDA. And also to provide a background and rationale for setting them, consistent with what's found in Section 402A1 of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Again, under the Code of Federal Regulations, Title 21, Section 109(6)D, this is the section where we look specifically at setting action levels, but other types of levels for contaminants in food, such as tolerances or regulatory limits. We look at foods as adulterated within the meaning of this section 402A1 of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So adulteration is actually defined under 402A1. 402 also gives us authority or defines adulteration not just for chemicals, but under other sections in regard to addition of food additives, but also pesticides and addition of other types of chemicals. So in general, FDA's guidance documents do not establish legally enforceable responsibilities. Instead, guidances describe FDA's current thinking on a topic and should be viewed only as recommendations unless specific regulatory or statutory requirements are cited. So these aren't regulations, but are guidance levels. The use of the word should in FDA guidances means that something is suggested or recommended, but not required. Next slide, please. So this is slide 3. FDA has been working on issues related to toxic elements in the food supply for decades. Closer to Zero is our new plan, but we have been working in regard to toxic elements for years. It goes all the way back to looking at lead soldered cans, but also other issues. So more recently in 2017, FDA created a working group. This identified priorities in this area. At that time, we did identify 4 toxic elements. This is lead, but also arsenic, cadmium, and mercury. These were identified as priority contaminants due to their relative toxicity, prevalence in the food supply, and the relative contribution of food as a source of exposure. At that time, we also prioritized young children because of the impact exposure to toxic elements can have on their development. As part of our approach, as laid out in 2021, when FDA released the Closer to Zero plan, the agency affirmed its commitment to establishing these action levels for toxic elements in food intended for babies and young children, based on evolving science on health impacts, as well as mitigation techniques and input from industry on achievability. We expect the draft action levels in the guidance and discussed today, along with draft action levels for lead in juice, as announced in 2022, will result in even lower levels of lead in the U.S. food supply. Next slide, please. So at the heart of FDA's Close to Zero plan is what we call a cycle of continual improvement. This is a science-based iterative approach for gradually driving exposures from food lower over time. So up in the left top corner, this is evaluate. This is where we first evaluate the current science to develop a reference level. Lead is unique in that there is no safe level. So we actually had to go out and develop an interim reference level. This was based on blood lead reference value from CDC. And although we can't say that the reference level is safe, a safe level, it is a level we can rely on as a benchmark to measure exposures from food. Reference levels guide the development of action levels for specific foods and categories of foods. Action levels are the levels of contamination in a food that could lead FDA to take action. For example, for a domestic food, we would recall that, or if it was an imported food, we would detain and reject that food. We will propose action levels and then get input from its stakeholders on current levels of achievability. For example, can they meet these action levels? If not, is there something that they could do to mitigate? So is there feasibility for making reductions? We then adjust the proposed action levels based on the current science for managing the contaminants, and then finalize the action levels based on this information. So again, we will finalize, but action levels, unlike regulations, are much easier to adjust. And so based on the science, such as can levels be reduced in foods, but also in regard to toxicity, have we obtained any additional information in regard to the toxicity of the toxic element, in this case, lead. So we will continually look at an action level even after finalized and determine whether there's information that could be used to revise that. And generally, we're talking about revising that down. So that's our cycle of continual improvement. Next slide, please. So just focusing on lead, this is slide 5. This element is toxic to humans and can affect people of any age or health status. Lead is especially harmful to vulnerable populations, including infants, but also young children, women who are pregnant and their fetuses, as well as others with chronic health conditions. Even low lead exposure can harm children's health and development, specifically the brain and nervous system. Neurologic effects of lead exposure during early childhood include learning disabilities, but also behavior difficulties and lowered IQ. Lead exposures also may be associated with immunological, cardiovascular, renal, but also reproductive and developmental effects. Because lead can accumulate in the body, even low-level chronic exposure can be hazardous over time. Next slide, please. And this is slide 6. Regarding occurrence, lead is widely present in the environment, and this is due to natural occurrence, but also human activities. Because lead may be present in the environment where crops for food intended for babies and young children are grown, various foods may contain low levels of lead. Potential sources of lead in food include a contaminated soil where agricultural crops are grown, but also contaminated water. Atmospheric deposition is another pathway from industrial activities, but also old lead-containing equipment if used to manufacturing food. So this isn't necessarily an issue in the U.S., but certainly in other countries which are maybe using equipment that is older and has these lead soldered surfaces. So again, a lot of our food does come not just from the U.S., but over globally. So we do have to think about where food is processed as well and what kind of equipment is being used. As a result of the 3 sources, agricultural crops can take up lead from contaminated soil and water, and also lead that may be deposited on plant surfaces. Next slide, please. So this is slide 7. Studies suggest that manufacturers may be able to reduce lead levels in food by using certain practices such as peeling root vegetables, as well as washing fruits and vegetables, particularly leafy vegetables. It's also possible in some cases for manufacturers who have found elevated levels in food or food ingredients intended for babies and young children to source food or food ingredients with low or no detectable lead levels. Again, that is particularly can be focused on these particular foods in that they are made and marketed specifically for babies. Manufacturers could also increase testing of ingredients or finished products that are historically known to contain elevated lead levels. This is particularly important for ingredients or finished products intended for babies and young children. Additionally, manufacturers could consider examining their facilities, processes, and equipment to ensure that they're not contributing to lead in their products. Next slide, please. And slide 8. This slide provides background information on actions taken by FDA, but also the international community involving lead in food. Briefly, in 2011, JECFA, the WHO, FAO, Joint Expert Committee on Food Additives, reassessed the safety of lead, and they concluded after this assessment that it was not possible to establish a new provisional tolerable weekly intake, or PTWI. And this is a tox reference value that could be health or would be health protective. As a result of this and their own evaluation, in 2018, we replaced this provisional tolerable daily intake that had been established in the early 90s with the first interim reference level, or IRL. In 2022, we have updated the lead IRL to reflect CDC's updated blood lead reference value. And that recently published IRL was used to inform the development of the action levels found in this guidance. Next slide, please. So this is slide 9. In developing the proposed action levels, we did look at dietary exposure from the identified foods so that they do not cause babies, young children to exceed the interim reference level for lead while still being achievable for manufacturers. So we look not just at levels found in the food, but also how much of that food is being consumed. For fruits and vegetables, this is excluding single ingredient root vegetables, mixtures, yogurts, custards, puddings, and single ingredient meats, all of which have low lead levels. Action levels are proposed at 10 parts per billion. For single ingredient root vegetables and dry infant cereals, FDA expects that action levels of 20 parts per billion will minimize the likelihood of significant exposure to lead, while also considering achievability for these different types of foods. Next slide, please. So this is slide 10. In developing the proposed action levels, FDA considers both the intake of the food, but also the maximum level of lead that could be in the food without causing the interim reference level to be exceeded. As part of this evaluation, FDA examined FDA toxic elements and food compliance program data, as well as FDA survey data, and also FDA, what we call total diet study data. And this was collected between 2014 and 2020 to determine current lead levels in food intended for babies and young children. So FDA's TDS, this is a program that's been around for since 1961. It was used to look at fallout from nuclear testing, and specifically iodine-131, but also other types of radionuclides in the milk supply. But it's basically been expanded to include toxic elements, but actually pesticides, mycotoxin, other radionuclides. So there's about 800. But this data actually wasn't used in exposure and achievability assessments because what we do with that program is composite the data. So we actually have 3 samples that we collect within 3 cities from each region of the country, and there's 6 regions. We then, from the 3 cities, composite that and then analyze that. And part of this is because this isn't a regulatory program, compliance program. What we're trying to do is look at overall exposure or intake for different chemicals or pesticides. Therefore, we didn't use that TDS data for the analysis. We did look at the data from the toxic element program and additional FDA survey data. To examine the effect of the proposed action levels for food intended for babies and young children on lead exposure, we then compare the estimated concentration of lead in these foods and dietary exposure to lead from these foods with and without the action levels. To assess achievability or manufacturer's ability to achieve the action levels for lead, we then determined the percentage of samples in each food category that fell at or below the proposed action levels. In the end, FDA proposed a higher draft action level, 20 parts per billion for single ingredient root vegetables, as well as dry infant cereals, in order to minimize the likelihood of significant exposure to lead, but also considering achievability. And again, part of it's a balance between trying to reduce levels of toxic elements, but also not make a food no longer available, because certainly we do know a lot of these foods contain not just toxic elements but also nutrients, which are required by babies and young children, not just for their nutrient requirements, but also they affect and can reduce the effects of toxic elements as well. Next slide, please. So this is some of the data that I just discussed that we used in calculating these action levels, but also the achievability. The first set is from our toxic elements and food compliance program. This was 356 baby food samples collected in fiscal years 2008 to 2021. In addition, data used from FDA surveys included 147 baby food samples collected in fiscal years 2013 to 2014, as well as 360 baby food samples collected in fiscal year 2021. And a review of the 686 samples of TDS data is also included in the draft guidance, but as I previously noted, because these TDS samples are composite samples rather than individual samples, they're not used in the exposure and achievability assessments. Next slide, please. So this is slide 12. To examine the effect of these proposed action levels for food, we compared the estimated concentration of lead in the foods and dietary exposure to lead from these foods with and without the proposed action levels, as shown in the table. Removing all samples with lead concentrations greater than the proposed action level from the data sets resulted in a decrease in the estimated lead concentrations, as well as the estimated dietary exposures from these foods. The upper bound percentile or 90th percentile was chosen as a health protective measure to account for babies and young children aged 0 to 23 months who consume larger amounts of food and would therefore have higher exposures. The proposed action levels for lead are estimated to result in reductions in lead exposure for consumption of these foods at the 9th percentile consumption level for babies and young children as follows. For fruits, vegetables, this is excluding the single ingredient root vegetables, but also mixtures, yogurts, custard puddings, and single ingredient meats. There would be a 26% reduction in lead exposure. For the single ingredient root vegetables, where there would be a 27% reduction in lead exposure. And for dry infant cereals, there would be a 24% reduction in lead exposure. And then for achievability, or as I mentioned, manufacturer's ability to achieve the proposed action levels for lead, we determined the percentage of samples in each food category that fell at or below the proposed action levels. The achievability for each food category at the proposed action levels is in the 90 to 95th, or rather 95% range, except for single ingredient root vegetables that had a lower achievability of 88%. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, these proposed action levels are part of FDA's effort under the Closer to Zero plan to reduce exposure to toxic elements from foods eaten by babies and young children to the lowest possible levels. In our experience, action levels have been effective tools for encouraging manufacturers to lower the levels of contaminants in their products. For example, we did issue a draft action level for inorganic arsenic in infant rice cereal. And we have found that even before we issued the final guidance that include those final action levels, we did see a very large reduction in inorganic arsenic in this infant rice cereal. And again, this is most likely the result of sourcing rice that's used in making infant rice cereal to lower levels of inorganic arsenic and resulting in lower levels in the final product. We established these action levels. These are in consideration of our interim reference level for dietary lead. And the action levels, as we showed, are achievable by industry when control measures are taken to minimize the presence of lead. We do intend to consider the proposed action levels as an important source of information for determining whether a food intended for babies and young children is adulterated within the meaning of Section 402A1 of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. We are accepting comments on the draft guidance that is until March 27th. So that was yesterday. We have received a comment in regard to extending the comment period. So we are actually looking at that now and considering that. So that would be an additional time to provide some additional comments. A manufacturer may choose to implement the recommendations in a draft guidance before the guidance becomes final. In addition to establishing action levels for lead in baby food, we will work with manufacturers of these products to encourage the adoption of best practices to lower levels of lead in foods intended for babies and young children. Next slide, please. I think that was my last slide. Well, I'll end there, but I'm certainly happy to answer any questions. I think there is a question and answer to follow. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Great.